All right. In case you just showed up, this is what we're getting ready to study. Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. And I would love to ask you, when was the last time you ever read Joshua or Judges? Probably been a while. So, glad you're in class. I was going to say, before getting ready for class, which does bring up another issue, we're reading so much for every single week that there's no way I can take time to really read through the scripture each week as part of class. If we did that, I'd have half a class period. So you really need to read the chapters before you show up at class. And even if you do, since like today there's no handout, Babs has reminded me already, it would be a good idea to either bring a Bible from home, if you can, dust it off and bring it, or there's Bibles over here on the side to grab, just so you can kind of walk your way through the text and make sure I'm being honest with what I tell you about the things that are actually in the text. And so, in addition, here's what we're going to look at today, the first 5 chapters of the book of Joshua. Okay? Doing 5 chapters, we're going to be pedal to the metal, or metal to the pedal, or pedal whatever it is. We're going to be off to the races anyway here in just a moment. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. God, we readily confess this morning that we're setting off on a journey we're not even certain we want to take, through books we've rarely read, with decided opinions about what we think they say. Grant us minds open to learn of you, hearts open to receive from you, and ears open to listen to you. We invite you to convince us by the time this course is complete that what you said about yourself long ago is still true, that you are the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Amen. Well, all right. So if you really only read these books of the Bible based on what happens in Sunday morning worship, you know that there are only 3 times we ever get to the book of Joshua in Sunday morning worship. There's 1 time we get to the book of Judges, and 2 times that we get to the book of Ruth. So most of what is going to be said through this particular class over the next several weeks, if what you know is based on those books in worship on Sunday mornings, it's all going to be brand new to you. Let's put it in context, though, before we really get going, in case you don't know what's happening in the book of Joshua. Prior to this point in Scripture, let's kind of leave behind Genesis for the moment. The Hebrew people have been enslaved in Egypt for apparently hundreds of years. There comes an exodus where Moses is able to get them out. They take 2 months from the moment they get out of Egypt to get to Mount Sinai. Then they spend somewhere in the neighborhood of about 10 months at Mount Sinai, camped out. And then finally comes the moment when God says, okay, time to move, and they take off. And then for 39 years, they wander around in the wilderness, camped at 22 different sites, assuming that there aren't other places that Scripture doesn't tell us about, which means, incidentally, in case you never put it together, that they weren't just stopping, and then moving on day by day by day. They would camp out for somewhere in the neighborhood of about 20 months at a time, on average, at a spot before they would then move on to the next place. And at the end of about 38 and a half years, they then move 6 times in 6 months after Aaron dies, and they finally arrive at the plains of Moab on the eastern side of what is Canaan. And that's when Moses dies. And 1 month later is when the book of Joshua opens up. Got it? Okay. And right at this particular moment in time, as all of this is getting ready to happen, all of us except maybe 2 or 3 of us old guys and gals, we're dead. And it's the new generation taking over. The old generation has proven to be quite faithless. That's why they're dead. The new generation, we don't know whether they're going to be faithful or faithless. That too is where this particular book opens up. Questions abounding. We're soon going to begin to have some answers to that, but at least on the front end, we don't know. There is 1 or 2 things in terms of just the big picture for Joshua that are good to know on the front end. This book is about showing us, readers, how faithful God is. This particular book is all about God fulfilling a promise that had been made centuries previously to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Even though the promise is centuries old, supposedly we shouldn't take that either for granted, nor should we be too surprised, because it took God 25 years to fulfill that other promise to Abraham that he was going to have a child, a son. So the fact that it's taken a few hundred years to fulfill this other promise, I'll just take it in stride. But that other promise, that this land, Canaan, is going to be yours, I'm going to give it to your descendants, is about ready to happen. All through this book, we see how God actually does bring that to pass. And it will end up being the same way much of what happens in our own lives occurs. God makes a promise and does make an offer, a gift, but it does involve us having a role in that, the receiving of that particular gift. And I'll leave that alone and not say anything more about it. The spiritual side of that for us today is that this book is about a transition in life. There's a navigation from the way life used to be to the way life is. None of us were alive when this illustration happened, but it's kind of like the difference between FDR and HST. Do you even know what that means? All right, got a history person in our midst. Or it's like the difference between Depression-era poverty and post-war financial success. That may be even a better illustration of what's getting ready to happen here. And in case that doesn't make any sense, since most of us, in fact all of us, are part of that post-war success, then it's kind of like the difference between a Jim Crow era and a civil rights era. That one we've at least, many of us, lived through, or still living in the midst of. So it's an exciting time, this particular book, where this transition of sorts is taking place. It's a very exciting time, especially if you're part of the younger generation. Us old guys, we're dead. But the younger generation is beginning to realize we can have something now. So it's exciting, but it's also terrifying. Is that text too small for anyone?
It's a lot of stuff.
It's a lot of stuff.
That's the reason why we didn't want to come.
But you're here, that's the important.
I know. That's such a good one.
Got that read? When was the last time you were in a Sunday school class and you heard bam? benefit of the doubt. That's all I'm asking for as well. Give me a chance as we work our way into this text, especially if it's been a while since you read it, and you go home and begin reading it, you may want to say, what the heck is he getting us into? Give me the benefit of the doubt, and we'll work our way through it. And yes, we will address many of these questions along the way. I may not give you satisfactory answers, but we will attempt to address some of the questions along the way. All right, you ready? Here we go. A few introductory matters as we jump into the text. Joshua, his real name is Hoshea. Moses renames him from Hoshea to Joshua. And this ends up being the very first name in the entire Bible that is based upon the name of Yahweh. That J-O part. First name that includes the name of God, our God, is part of the actual name. He's called many things throughout these early pages of Exodus, as well as Joshua. The very first time he appears, he's climbing up a mountain, Mount Sinai, to be with Moses. While he's up there coming back down, he hears a lot of noise down below and thinks it's a war going on. It's a big party that's going on. He's going to learn a few things along the way, but on the front end, we realize that there are many things he doesn't know. He does make wrong decisions about things. He doesn't completely interpret necessarily on the front end correctly how things are going. It's an important thing for a leader to learn. An important thing for a leader to learn. It's important things for a leader to learn that often you don't know what you think you know. He wants people to stop prophesying unless their name is Moses. Another time that he's wrong. He is one of the guys who goes into Canaan as a spy. He's one of the two who come back and say, yeah, it's a good land, we should go in. But his way, they don't listen to him and they ignore him, and that's what leads to all the wandering for so many years. By the time you get to the end of the book of Numbers, he is chosen by Moses to be his successor. He knows that his job moving forward is to do that which Moses has done up to this particular point in time. And as part of that, there are two things that he's going to be responsible for. Two things that if he had thought about it, he might have wanted to say no to Moses. The first is that he was going to have to hold accountable those tribes that were the 2.5 tribes that were going to stay over on the east side of Jordan and not come in to Canaan. The tribes that become known as the Transjordanian tribes. It was going to be his responsibility to make sure that they keep the vows that they had made to Moses. More about that in just a bit. Then it was also going to be his job. Moses had talked about this, but of course he doesn't live long enough to be able to actually do this. It's going to be his job to actually divide up the land of Canaan between the various tribes that will become known as Israel. These Hebrew tribes that at this point, after 39 years, we can really just call them a band of wandering nomads. But it's going to be his job to divide it up in a way that everybody's happy about. Yeah, good luck on that one. In case you don't know, most of the dates in the Old Testament are tied to dates in Egypt. We don't have time to go into much of that, so you're just going to have to trust me on the front end, or if you don't like it, look it up yourself. Dates in the Old Testament are based on dates in Egypt. To the degree that we know those dates in Egypt, we can kind of guess at the dates that are taking place in the Old Testament. But there are still issues. There are two particular moments based on biblical words as well as Egypt dates as to when the Exodus occurs, either somewhere in the middle of the 15th century BC or somewhere toward the end of the 13th century BC. For our purposes, it really doesn't matter which of those two is correct, but it's somewhere between about 1450 and about 1220 that this particular Exodus and then movement into Canaan by these Hebrew people is actually taking place. That's the best we can do. somewhere in that particular framework. Leave that alone. There are some issues, though, that take place, and this is what makes it even more difficult to know which of those two dates might be right. Archaeologists enter into this discussion. And one of the things that archaeologists like are piles of rock. And they also like piles of rock that have been burned. And they work off an assumption that if Taylor comes in and destroys Bab's city, then he burns it to the ground. And so archaeologists look at the Hebrew incursion into Canaan and says, well, we can't find any cities in Canaan, in Israel, that were burned between 1440-ish and 1220-ish. Therefore, it's not true. Can't be. They got in here somehow, but it's not by military conquest. Completely ignoring the fact that when we get down to Judges 11, the text itself says they didn't burn towns when they came in. But that doesn't matter. The archaeologists say if Hebrews come in, they got to burn the cities down. There are no burned cities in Israel during this particular time period. So it's a bit of a struggle to know for sure about the dates. So they want to say instead that, well, the Hebrews were a bunch of desert nomads who simply came in and peacefully just kind of took over. As they moved in, the Canaanites moved out. And there's another group that want to say that, well, what happened was that actually the Hebrew people were already living there. They were peasants, and they rose up like good Marxists, and they took over their Canaanite overlords. All three of these are viable options today in the scholarly world. We're just going to jump back to the way the text talks about it and says that they come in and there's a military incursion that takes place. If you want to move beyond that, I'll let you take a graduate course in a seminary somewhere. But for our purposes, we're going to just follow the text and see what the text tells us as we work our way along. If you don't want to go to seminary, there's an article right here that you're welcome to take from me, and in 5 or 6 pages it will tell you all that stuff so that you know the difference between all of those. And if you're bored with class, I'm happy to give this to you. You can read it the rest of it. We don't know who wrote this book. We don't know when this book was written. The Jewish Talmud says that Joshua wrote the book. It's called Joshua. But we don't know that. Other folks say, well, no, Samuel was the one, the last of the judges, the first of the really prophets. He's the one who wrote the book. You can say Willie wrote the book. We don't have any idea who wrote it, nor do we know when it was written. Although there are a lot of internal things within the book that strike those who know about such stuff that, you know, there was at least a draft of this that was written pretty doggone early, because a lot of the cities that are referred to and the names that they're used for them are pretty early. And the locations where things are, it's pretty early. So all things being considered, it seems as if an early draft of this is pretty early. And we don't know what happens after that. Lots of discussions, but for our purposes, it really doesn't matter all that much. There are some real issues, though. Importantly, one of the things that we learn in this book is that God keeps God's promises. I've already mentioned that. They get in to Canaan. That's important. And also within this particular book, we begin to be introduced to something that's really very important that we still to this day hold to, kind of a theological interpretation of history, that God is involved in what takes place on a day-to-day basis. That doesn't mean that God's making everything happen and we're just puppets. It's nothing at all like that. You may remember a few weeks ago I had a sermon in which I talked briefly about predestination, not as that which makes us do certain things, but if nothing else, really provides a trajectory a God-designed, God-desired trajectory within which we can live. So there are things like that that are certainly the case within this book. But we discover that, like the conquest of Canaan itself, it's not due to the military might and insight of the Hebrew people. It's really a gift of God. That's why they had it. God gave it to them. Not because they were so wise or discerning or powerful or insightful or skilled or whatever it is that we kind of tout ourselves about. It's that God gave it to them. That too is kind of an important thing to keep in mind moving forward in life, even if you don't remember anything else about this particular text. That what we have, what we enjoy in life is really a gift from God. And I hope you've lived long enough to begin to kind of figure that one out on your own. I said something or other about cities. If you start looking at maps, you'll discover that all these cities that are mentioned, we don't know where they were located. If Stephen makes a map, he sticks them in these spots. And then Fleece comes along with her map and goes, no. Here. And then Tom comes along and goes, no, here. And so if you look at different Old Testament maps, you're going to say, I don't get it. Well, nobody gets it. They're just kind of put in. We kind of know. Fayetteville. Is that town in Arkansas? Or is it Missouri? Or is it Tennessee? Or is it North Carolina? In case you don't, in case you're just an Arkansan, all those other places have a Fayetteville too. Well, there are lots of, for instance, Bethlehems. There are lots of other cities in the Old Testament that are in multiple locations. They didn't have a post office that would say, no, we already have that name. You can't use that name. So every tribe would stick these names that they know inside their tribal area. So we don't really know where many of these towns, generally we know, but not specifically we know. The other big issue that we're going to have to deal with is there's a lot of violence in this book. It's been a while since you read it. You may have to take a deep breath as you jump into it. And it will produce in you some questions that we'll look forward to dealing with. Enough about introductions. Jump into the text now. As I said, I hope you read it. If you don't, some of this may not make a whole lot of sense, but here we go. Chapter 1 in the book of Joshua consists of 4 speeches. A speech from God to Joshua, then a speech from Joshua to the tribes of Israel, and then another speech from Joshua to the Transjordanian tribes, and then a response speech from the Transjordanian tribes back to Joshua. God to Joshua, Joshua to the tribes, Joshua to the Transjordanian tribes, and then the Transjordanian tribes back to Joshua. Ready for chapter 2? So there are 4 things in God's speech to Joshua that matter to us. The first is what I've already said. Canaan is a divine gift. I'm giving it to you. You're going to have to come in. You've got to respond, but I'm giving it to you. I am fulfilling that promise that I made long ago. And as part of that, your response is, get ready to cross. Get up off your duffs. You've been there 6 months. You've been now weeping for Moses being gone for a month. Time to get up and get ready to cross. That's the first thing God tells Joshua. Second thing is what I would call sort of an Emmanuel promise. I will be with you. It isn't something that just Jesus said in the Gospel of Matthew. It is something that God says to Isaac. It's the first time. It's something that God says to Moses. It is something that God says to Joshua. It is something that Gospel of Matthew says is the very last thing that Matthew says to his disciples and thus to us. I will be with you. It isn't just a subjective, "Aw, isn't that nice?" kind of comment. It is an objective statement that says, there's nothing that you're going to do in life where you will be alone. I will be with you. Take that. Hold my hand and let's move forward. Pretty important. There are lots of times, especially for clergy folks doing clergy things, but certainly for you all doing what you do, where you're a bit tentative moving forward. You know, it doesn't matter if it's job related or relationship related or life related, steps you got to take moving forward that you're just not sure you want to take or how you're going to do it. Well, there's somebody with you, somebody important who's there with you at every step along the way. But that doesn't make it necessarily easy. So the third thing that God says to Joshua is, be strong, be courageous, don't be disappointed. Because this is going to be hard. It isn't just a walk in the park. If you think the Bible is just full of fluffy niceness, it just means you haven't read the Bible. It's very different from that. It's pretty true to life, and we're going to see that as we work our way through Joshua. The fourth thing that God tells Joshua is keep the law, learn the law, study the law, speak the law. There are people who think, you know, you just be good, keep your nose clean, and that's all that matters. But there's a whole lot more to it. God wants us to actually enter into a relationship with God and learn of God, and the way that we do that is through that which God has told us. And one of the intriguing things that God tells Joshua here on the front end is read, speak, think the law. Which might be a reminder to us of when we first began to learn. One of the things that we did was when we would open up a book, we would read aloud, because reading aloud helps somehow or other get this into here. It really does. It's just that in our own day and age, we've decided, reading out loud is childish. And so we stopped doing it, which may go a long way to explaining why it is that we never actually learn anything that we read. Yeah, I'd love to say a whole lot more about that, but I've got a book of Joshua to work on. And in case you don't know this, it was sometime around 1800 that books began realizing that books didn't realize, but the people publishing the books realized that people weren't reading their books out loud anymore, at least not in the way that they always had before. And so there was a huge change that occurred in books. Anybody know enough about books to know what happened about 1800?
Printing press.
Well, the printing press happened a little bit earlier, but so there were already books that people could hold by this point, but something happens to the text itself that is printed, certainly. At the bottom of every page, whether it's the obverse or what's the other side called? Down at the very bottom on the right, there is a word that's underneath the text, underneath this big block of text. And if you pay attention, it's the first word on the next page. And when you get to the bottom of that page, at the very bottom on the right, there is a word, which when you get to the next page is the first word. They did that because if you were reading out loud, you know that when you look at your worship folder, you sometimes get lost from where you are at the bottom of the page to the next page. So it gives you the first word onto the next page for that transition moment when you turn the page. They expected you to be actually reading it aloud. So if you want to see if that's really true, I'll let you look at this book.
Man, we do that in music, you know.
Yeah, maybe that's why everybody remembers music, remembers all those songs. Second speech, Joshua speaks to the Hebrew officers, and he basically says to them what God said to him. get yourselves ready to cross. Third speech. He says to the Transjordanian tribes, you told Moses that you were going to not just settle there, but you were going to fight alongside the rest of the tribes when they actually enter into the land. You made that vow. I'm going to hold you to that vow. Your families can stay in the Transjordan area, but you are going to, the men who are of a certain age, who are the soldiers, you're going to have to cross over with everybody else as we enter into Canaan. If there's going to be rest for you in the Transjordanian area, you're going to have to help provide rest to those who go west of the Jordan River. And the Transjordanian tribes say, yep, we made that vow, and yes, we're going to keep it. See, this is going to be easier than you thought, isn't it? Chapter 2. As we jump into chapter 2, I have to introduce to you something that you're often going to find in the Old Testament. Something that will probably surprise you, and yet it shouldn't. Because this is something you know, and you know how it works because you watch movies. You know how flashbacks work in the movies. You know when there's a flashback in the movie, unless the director's really trying to pull your chain and keep you from knowing. But you know how flashbacks work. It's just most of us are literalists when it comes to reading, and we don't know how it works in print. We're just stupid when it comes to being readers. The Old Testament uses flashbacks a lot to tell the story, just like a good director. So when we jump into I tell you that because when we jump into chapter 2, there are flashbacks. In fact, there are 3 flashbacks. And if you just very naively are just reading along, you get to the end of chapter 1 and then you start chapter 2, it's not like you are sequentially, chronologically continuing to move forward. It doesn't work that way. Chapter 2 starts with flashbacks that you have to fit back into the story, which forces you to do a little work. Where does it fit? Where am I supposed to plug? Where in chapter 1 is this supposed to get plugged into? And it does that 3 times as you work your way through chapter 2. Okay, so the Hebrews, we've left them camped back over at a spot called Abel Shittim, the place of the acacia trees. And this is where Joshua says to them, get up off your duffs, we're ready to cross over into the other side of the Jordan, into Canaan itself. And so he sends 2 spies over into Canaan to discover some stuff. This whole story makes no sense unless it is a flashback. He has said, it's time to go. Hold that thought. Let's pick up a flashback point. Way back there, when he first tells the people what God has said to them, that's when he sends these 2 spies over into Jericho to scope out what's happening over there, find out what it's really like. And while that's happening, that's where chapter 2 kind of moves forward a bit. Near the city entrance into Jericho, there is most likely an inn, a place where people could stay if they happened to be wandering by and had nowhere else to be able to stay. That particular inn is where a lady by the name of Rahab lives. She's, according to Josephus, she's an innkeeper. She keeps the inn. Scripture itself, both here and in other places, refers to her as a prostitute. There's no reason why she can't be both. Being a prostitute, more or less at this point in time, in fact all the way through the Old Testament, probably means that she had a husband, but husband is dead, she has no kids, and she's got to do something to be able to make her way through life. So she sells her body to be able to have some funds to be able to live. The story isn't concerned about her being a prostitute. intriguingly enough for those of us who think that morality is all that matters in life. That's all we need to know about Rahab on the front end. King comes by, which raises a question about the size of Jericho. We'll get to that in a moment. But a king comes by and says, we know that there were a couple of spies who showed up at your inn/brothel. Where are they? Which, if nothing else, tells us that the king is keeping close tabs on what's going on over at the Jordan River. Now, incidentally, the Jordan River is about 6 miles from Jericho. Jericho is 6 miles west of the Jordan River. There's just this big plain that more or less runs, just a big flat area between the Jordan River and Jericho, mostly flat. I might as well say it here. Jericho is, at one point in time, was a huge city. In fact, in antiquity, which doesn't mean Old Testament times, but I mean thousands of years before the Old Testament, Jericho was probably the biggest city in the world, or at least the middle section of the world. By the time of our story, it's been ransacked and blown up many, many times. There probably aren't 1,500 or 2,000 people living in Jericho at the time of this story. It's small. In fact, some thoughts are that maybe it's only a couple hundred people. That seems a little tiny to me, so I'm going to go with a couple thousand people living here at this particular moment in time, which probably turns the king of Jericho into something more like a mayor or a little chieftain of sorts. You know, it's kind of overseeing this little ward within Springdale. But nevertheless, he's keeping very close tabs on what's happening about 6 miles away over there on the Jordan River. Why? Well, there is this Chinese army that is massed on the Jordan River. The estimates are, if you take the numbers seriously, in the book of Exodus, there's 3 million people that get out of the Exodus. That's a lot of people to be massed 6 miles away from your little tiny village of a couple thousand people. He wants to know what's going on over there. So he's keeping tabs. He's noticed that a couple have made their way across and came into the town, but you can't find them anywhere. So where, if you are the chieftain or the mayor of Springdale, where would you go to find them? Well, you go to the inn, to the brothel, to find where they might be. And so the king shows up and asks Rahab where they are. She says, I don't know. Yeah, there were a couple guys who came here, but I didn't know anything about them. Showed up. And he asks some more questions, and she says, well, no, they left. They've already gone. You probably, if you take off, you can catch them. And so the king sends his, not told who they were, but some soldiers out to go chase him down, and then shuts the gates of the city. And you are meant to, at this point in time in the story, do what some of you were doing. Just kind of snicker and giggle a bit. Because here is another one of those stories, just like in Exodus 1, where a couple of Hebrew midwives pull a fast one on Pharaoh. All those, you know, they're being told to kill off all the little Hebrew baby boys. Girls, you know, they're harmless, they can live, but the boys, you got to kill them off. And so the midwives pay no attention, and when called to the carpet, they say, oh, well, those Hebrew women, they're vigorous, and we can't get there in time. They've already had their baby, and it's gone by the time. And Pharaoh goes, okay. Plan B. King comes to Rahab and says, where are they? Oh, they've left. Oh, okay. So then take off. Another flashback. When you get to verses 8 to 14, it's not just the story continued, it's stuck back into the midst of the story that we just read. Rahab begins to have a conversation with these men. Well, before she even has the conversation, really, we learn that what she has done is hidden the men up on top of the roof. She's been drying out some flax. And so she has hidden them up there, knowing full well that most likely the king's going to come by to want to know where these guys are. Hide up there. Well, why? Because of this conversation. She knows that there's this massive group of people over here on the Jordan River. And they're most likely going to come right our direction. And she tells these two spies, everybody here in Jericho is scared spitless. We don't know what to do, except that we're dead. We have no hope whatsoever. And it's not just us, it's everybody around. There's nobody in Canaan that has a clue how to move forward. We're all scared because of you. And so she starts to cut a deal with them. She establishes a covenant with them. She says, I will save you, but in turn, I need you to save me. Somehow or other, she knows that not only has this group over here somehow got out of Egypt 40 years previously, but she knows that 6 months prior to this, they've killed off the king of Og and Sihon, all those really bad guys, the ogres over on the east side of the Jordan River. They know that. And that's why they're scared. And so she tries to cut this deal with them to save her skin. Okay, now, Hebrew people have already been told, when I get you in, everybody's got to get killed. Nobody gets to live once they come in. But here, as the story gets going, the very first person that we're introduced in Canaan is a woman who ends up getting saved. Why? I mean, she's a Canaanite. When she says, I want you to be kind to me because I'm being kind to you, I'm going to save you here. I'm going to put you under the flax up on my roof. She's using a word that in Hebrew, it gets translated into English as loyalty or loving kindness. It's that word that describes how God is covenantally faithful to you and never leaves you, never abandons you, is always with you and is on your side. That which is most true of God is the way she's trying to act toward these two men, and she's hoping that they will in turn act the same way toward her. These two men on the fly, Joshua's nowhere around, they have to make a decision. Do we agree to this covenant that she has made, or do we not? And they decide to do so. Because they decide she has already chosen to be one of us. Yeah, she's grown up Canaanite. Yes, she is Canaanite. But internally, she's already effectively converted and become one of us. She's treating us with chesed and wants us to treat her with chesed. She's being gracious. She wants us to be gracious. She's one of us. And it is a reminder to us on the front end of this book of Joshua, what we already know in Scripture, is that you don't become Hebrew because your mommy and daddy were Hebrew. You become Hebrew because God is gracious and invites you to become Hebrew. And so, yeah, it is possible that I'm Hebrew culturally, nationally, but it's just as true that I can be Hebrew because I choose to do that which Hebrews do. If I'm in Egypt, when it comes time for them to leave, if I put blood on the door frames of my home, I can leave with them. And many do. We discover just a few pages further in the book of Exodus. And here, in these opening pages of Joshua, we discover that this Canaanite woman is just as Hebrew as the Hebrews. And so, it's not that they're saving a Canaanite, they're saving a Hebrew. And somewhere along the way, maybe you will remember that we too are non-Hebrews that get invited graciously in to become Hebrews. We get grafted onto that tree of Israel, or that vine of Israel ourselves. We're not superior to, we're part of. We've been invited to become just like they. And so the spies do that. They agree to what she has said, she agrees with them, and she then lets them out the window. The one thing that they had said to her, though, is, look, if we agree to this with you, don't double-cross us. We will save you and your whole family, father, brothers, sisters, etc., but only if you don't double-cross us. And furthermore, you got to make sure they're inside your house when we come, because otherwise we won't know. I mean, we don't know what they look like. So they got to be in your house when we show up. Fine, we'll do that. So then she lets them out, having told them, look, the king's going to be looking for you, and here's what he's going to do, and here's probably how he's going to do it. So when I let you out, you make sure that you go the other direction. Don't go back to the Jordan. Go up into the hills and just hang out a bit. Wait 3 days, and then after they get back here, because they probably won't stay out very long, I mean, it's just 6 miles, then you can make your way back with no trouble. So they do, and that's it. And there they are, getting out. And if you listened to me a couple minutes ago, I said Jericho is probably a town of about 2,000 people. This artist didn't make a wall that is appropriate to a little town of a couple thousand people. That would not have been as impressive. But ignore that. They're getting out of the window and getting ready to run up into the hills. 3 days later, they do get back over to the Hebrew camp. And what do they tell Joshua? The very thing that Rahab just told them. People are scared spitless. Isn't going to be a problem when we head over there. It's going to be a piece of cake. So we got to get them across the Jordan River. So as chapter 3 opens up, the Hebrew people make the move from the acacia trees because, you know, us church folk, we don't want to end up saying the word Shittim very many times, so we'll call them the acacia trees. They leave the acacia trees and head over to the edge of the Jordan River so that they can actually get across. Now, in case you don't know, Jordan River, at least at this particular area of it, is actually pretty shallow. Runs 3 feet to about 10 feet deep, and it's pretty narrow. It's at this point in between some hills on, at least on the one side, and a plain over here, so it's pretty narrow. It's not very wide, so it's pretty easy to get across. It's a place where you want to get across this particular river. It's definitely not the Mississippi or the St. Lawrence or Hudson. It's not even the Buffalo. It's more like the little Osage Creek that we're trying to get across here. And in case you don't know, the Jordan River is the lowest river on the face of the planet. It's like 700 feet below sea level up at the Sea of Galilee. It's like 1,300 feet below sea level when you get down to the Dead Sea. And that doesn't take into account that the Dead Sea is losing 4 feet every single year that you and me have been alive. So it's actually more like 1,400 feet below sea level at this particular point in time. What's the first thing that's going to get across the river? Anybody know the story? It's not going to be some old guy like you getting across the river to begin. It's going to be the Ark of the Covenant. We've been introduced that when the people get ready to move, the Ark of the Covenant will lead the way to the place of rest, to the land of rest. That has been true since they left Mount Sinai. It is true on this last portion of the trip when they make their way from the east bank over to the west bank of the Jordan River. So the Ark of the Covenant is going to be that which leads them over there. I'd love to say a lot more about the Ark of the Covenant, but one day I'll get to the New Testament and we can talk some more about it at that point. Just before they cross over, Joshua tells them that they need to do something that these folk hadn't done since they were kids. It's something that they did when they got ready to get out of Egypt, when they got ready to make the move away from Mount Sinai. They need to be consecrated. This is an important step that's being taken. It's the last of many steps that have occurred along the way, but it is so important you don't just do it, you get yourself ready to do it. So they will consecrate themselves just before they get ready to cross over the Jordan River. Here's how they do it. Joshua tells the priests that they are going to be the leaders who go across first. Well, not all the priests, the Kohathite Levites, the ones who actually carry the Ark of the Covenant. They are going to be the ones who get into the river first. You say, well, that's no big deal. It's only 3 feet deep, maybe 10 feet deep at the most. Well, it's the spring. Jordan River's at flood stage. Remember those words that God told Joshua. Be strong, be courageous, don't be discouraged, trust me. God has passed that on to these Kohathite priests going, you want us to do what? I want you to walk into the Jordan River and then stand there. Andrew is just on his way to becoming full-time priest? Full-time priest. If he doesn't already know, just based on how old he is, he's going to learn very quickly that there are times he wants to say, you want me to do what, God? But we already know that just from life itself, don't we? We don't have to become a priest to know that. Joshua does go ahead and tell them, look. Trust me here. When the Kohathite priests and the ark get into the middle of the Jordan River, the waters are going to pile up and stop. Just like something else that you remember occurred a long time ago. And sure enough, that's what will end up happening. People get ready to cross the Jordan River. So the ark, from back to the back where it is led all the way to the front. And they step into the river, and sure enough, the waters pile up. But unlike the Red Sea crossing, where they're just right there, and since Charlton Heston has to have done it properly, you can see them piled up like jello on either side of you. The Jordan River has piled up like 16 miles north in a little town called Adam. 16 miles, the Jordan River is completely devoid of water. There's no way under the earth that the Hebrew people can't get across. They all get across. And it's not until they get across that the waters will come back. Pretty amazing. We'll deal with that maybe at some point later. There they are getting ready. They're not even down to the river yet, but they're getting ready to cross. I like art, but there are times you just can't believe what you see, just like the city of Jericho in that previous one. If you know your Bible, you know that when the Ark of the Covenant moves, it has a leather cover put over the top of it. And over the leather cover, they put a covering of blue cloth. Yeah, that looks blue to me.
Doesn't look like covered either.
Apparently this artist didn't read Numbers chapter 4, verses 4 to 6. But, it's a good piece of art anyway. The last thing he tells, especially, well, not the priest, but the last thing he tells people themselves. He gathers a leader from each of the tribes to come be with him, and he says, you guys go back out into the river where the ark still is, and I want you to get a big rock, put it up on your shoulder and bring it out here. We're going to make a monument. Well, priests are always telling you rather ridiculous things and not explaining why you should do this, but they go ahead and pick up a rock from the middle of the Jordan River and they lug it out there and they make this memorial over on the west side of the Jordan River. And he says to them, yeah, nobody's going to know why you did that. It's going to be this strange thing sitting there. But everybody who comes along afterwards is going to say, why? And then that's when you can tell them, well, here's why. And you tell the story of how you got through the Jordan River and didn't even get your feet wet, of how God provided you this land. There are lots of memorials in our life as Christians. There are creeds, there are liturgies, there are sacraments, there are baptismal reaffirmations. There are lots of things to which we can point that other people would go, I don't get it, which provides us opportunities, openings to explain why, to share the faith, to be the evangelist that we are as God's people. So they get out, and lo and behold, those Transjordanian tribes have done precisely what they said they would do. There are 40,000 Transjordanian soldiers at the very front of them, ready to march west toward Jericho. Now, you may want to ask the question, if you didn't listen to me earlier, why on earth didn't Jericho come out and destroy the Hebrew people when they were in that plain just on the west side of the Jordan River? Well, it's because there were only 2,000 of them, and there's 40,000 Transjordanian soldiers, never mind all the rest of them, that are massed less than 6 miles away. They're staying back in their town, hoping that somehow or other those walls that were nowhere near as big as the walls that that artist in the late 19th century showed that they were, they don't have a clue how they're going to manage. They're not going to go out there and attack. They're staying back home, hoping they can just somehow survive. So the Hebrew people are ready to move forward, and we're about to the end of our time this morning. But you might think, okay, this should be pretty easy. But God is always saying really strange things to us. And here in this particular instance is one of the strangest. Instead of saying, okay, go get them, God says to them, okay, it's time to circumcise all the men. And so all of the men get circumcised, which puts them out of service for a few days. And there are so many foreskins that have been cut that they end up making a mountain out of them. And that's where this is. This is the place where they were. You can't see the foreskins now, but the place will eventually have a name change, not the mountain of foreskins, but it will become known as Gilgal, the place where God rolls things away. And that's where it takes place, on the edge of the Jordan River. Stare at that long enough, and you'll begin to see that that looks like a footprint. It's a good thing that Eric von Daniken didn't see this, because he might have put it in Chariot of the Gods. But anyway, it looks like a footprint leading toward Jericho, pointing the way. Not just the people in Jericho, but all the rest of the Canaanites and the Amorites, all the way from right on the edge of the Jordan River, all the way over to the Mediterranean, all the way from way up north to way far down south. We're told that everybody was scared stiff, scared spitless, because of what is apparently getting ready to happen. The Hebrews are invading, and we don't know what we're going to do. That's when they get circumcised, the Hebrew men. Strange way to get ready to go into battle. And the very next thing that happens is they have a Passover celebration. First time in 39 years. we're told that they get circumcised on 10 Abib, 10 Nisan. 4 days later, they've recovered enough to be able to celebrate Passover. And having celebrated Passover, the next day, all the manna that they've been receiving, all these 39 plus years, stops. It's time to start looking after yourself. Not because you're capable of looking after yourself, but now God is providing something else instead of manna, barley, inside this new land that's going to be able to grow it for you. So they eat barley for the first time in 40 years. Well, surely now they can head toward Jericho. Well, no, not quite yet. A strange little thing happens. They're getting ready to go, and something blocks their way. The angel of the Lord. And Joshua, instead of being scared, says, what now? Is there something I didn't do? And the angel says, nope, just making sure that you're on our side. And there, strangely, the story stops, and we're ready for part 2, which will be next week. All right, if you dare, come back next week and we'll continue with the story and see where it goes.